Eastern time and are still continuing today. And she's been running the computer for that most of the time. So she's just been a true champion through all this. She's going on like 25 hours without sleep. So I just want to give her a big thank you too.
Could we talk a little bit about the impact that collateral murder, the Afghan war logs, the Iraq war logs, and the Gitmo files have had on journalism, period, and then the attack on journalism going forward? And I'll leave that open to whoever wants to jump in and take it. Okay, I'll start assigning.
Well, maybe I could start. Okay. I can start. Let's take the collateral murder. Not many Americans have seen that, but those who have and have a soul still must be highly ashamed at not only what our troops did to others, killing civilians, but what our country has done to those troops. I mean, just think about those gunners. How have they fit back into society now? Why were they not held to account in some way or other? Now, we know that there was a Washington Post reporter with that unit. His name was David Finkel, okay? And he knew about the tape. He didn't touch it, of course. He later wrote a book about this wonderful patriotic unit, the same one, okay? And he got plaudits for it, and now he's a big gun on the Washington Post. So that puts it in bas relief, in my view. These were atrocities. These were visual things where you could see and hear the people we send into war kill civilians, okay? So what am I trying to say here? I'm trying to say that without this knowledge, without this way to get this knowledge out, we're forced to rely on the David Finkels of this world, and that's not enough. Now, the last thing I'll say here has to do with the Afghan war logs and the Iraqi war logs. What people said immediately, the commander of U.S. forces, commander of NATO forces, all the commanders said, it's awful. This is awful. This endangers our troops. People are going to be wrapped up and killed, and people cooperate with us will be wiped off the face of the earth. Now, as those rumors went around, there was a fellow named Levin, who was Carl Levin. He was head of the Senate Armed Forces Committee. And he called the Secretary of Defense at that time, Robert Gates, and he said, Mr. Gates, can you give me a memo on that? I want a damage assessment of what this has caused. And Gates said, okay. He came back 2 weeks later. Actually, it was in a speech. And he said, these reports of our sources and our cooperators about them being killed or molested are, in his words, quote, significantly overwrought. Okay. Now, I know Gates used to work for me when he was a CIA analyst. He chooses his words very carefully. Now, what he said was there was no real damage. And the commander of our forces in Afghanistan and Iraq said the same, and so did the Pentagon. So all that stuff was dismissed very early on, okay? Now, what do we see at the trial of Julian Assange, at the hearing in Belmarsh prison? The prosecutor, Her Majesty's counselor, starts out with saying, this is terrible damage. There are hundreds of people who have disappeared and are presumed to have been killed because they named or they're alluded to, and it's awful, and that's just where we have to get this guy and stop it, okay? Now, then he said, now the U.S. Can't vouch for this information. They don't have any names. It's just really a matter of people they used to cultivate disappearing, and the assumption is that it was because they were killed because of, hello, this suffices in a court that's supposed to be a court of law. So with respect to these things, there was no damage. take take Robert Gates's word for it, if you will. Charges of that were significantly overwrought, and they were still significantly overwrought when this hearing began. So you put those things together, and you have how much the U.S. government wants to prevent people from really knowing the real deal here, and that so far they've been successful. And let me just close by saying I'd like to invoke what I call the Noah principle. Okay. Now, the Noah principle is no more awards for predicting rain, rewards only for building arcs. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means that we know the situation. I hope that today and subsequent days, we can figure out what kinds of arcs to build here, because there's so much material that's come out recently, especially human material. And I have this vapid hope that Americans and other people of the world really care about human things. And when you see these two new little sons of Julian, Gabriel and Max and his fiancée, I mean, that introduces a real human element. And in my view, that explains to me why Julian Assange, who's a strong person to begin with, has a very strong interest in living, avoiding the plague and avoiding prison for the rest of his life. So all that stuff, I think, can be used as little arcs to build so that we're not just predicting rain, so that we're building arcs.
I would like to pick up where Ray has left off with this idea of building arcs and remind our audience that it's vitally important that we also play a role in deciding who's going to build the arcs, because the construction materials and the design might not be what we want, but we'll get an arc, but it just won't work for us. Mm-hmm. So toward that end, what I've thought about is what I would like to see coming from the United States Congress. So we had one statement from Rand Paul, and he basically said, well, let's just provide immunity and get him over here and let him testify so that we can know everything that he knows, or at least begin to know the things that he knows, or that, you know, those as yet unpublished information that WikiLeaks might have in its possession. Well, I think that was a step in the right direction, but you notice no one else has said anything. And the powers of the United States Congress are immense, but the power of one U.S. senator is perhaps could save Julian's life. And so now I think it's incumbent upon those of us who understand how to wield power that we have. We've got to get better people building these arcs. And we cannot accept substandard construction, which is what we have been accepting all along so far.
So let me go back to hit a few points here about how WikiLeaks has changed journalism. This is both a personal and a political answer. For me, I did a lot of my early work and was able to get my name out because I was using the entire cache of diplomatic cables that was published. And I made daily work out of going through this archive and looking at what exactly the U.S. empire was up to privately and publicly, because when you saw what their public actions were, you could compare it to what was happening privately and get closer to some truth. You'll notice if you go to the Washington Post or the New York Times or some of these other establishment media outlets, that as much as they dislike Julian Assange, they found the materials that were disclosed by WikiLeaks to be quite valuable in their work. You'll notice that events that have unfolded in the last couple of years were contextualized with the cables. What happened in Bolivia with the coup against Evo Morales, where he had to flee. What happened with the failed coup attempt in Venezuela. What's been happening throughout Latin America and other parts of the world. You're able to see that these U.S. outlets, as much as they may be swallowing what intelligence agencies are giving them and using that as the official story or their official narrative, they're still referring to what's in these U.S. documents. Another thing to point out is that you've had projects that were able to be launched in the last decade that got us closer to understanding what happened in wars. There was the Iraq Body Count Project that gave us a fuller picture of how many civilian deaths, and not just like how many we guess died in this war, but getting us closer to actually documenting the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who throughout Iraq had died because of the Iraq War. So I think that's quite crucial. When you go down the list of some of these revelations that came out, I think, one thing that does get under discussed is the Guantanamo detainee assessment files. It's worth noting that those were crucial in giving us a clear picture of the fact that these people who were rounded up and brought to this prison weren't ever the dangerous people that Donald Rumsfeld or anyone in the administration led us to believe. And in fact, there were people there like Al Jazeera journalist Sami al-Hajj, who was sent to the prison because of the fact that he was working for the Al Jazeera news network, and that he was there. He was brought there because they believed that Al Jazeera was involved in some kind of terrorist type journalism, that he was there because, and I quote, this is from the document, that they wanted to interrogate him about Al Jazeera News Network's training program, their telecommunications equipment and news gathering operations in Chechnya, Kosovo, and Afghanistan, including the network's acquisition of a video of Osama bin Laden and a subsequent interview. So they were using Sami al-Hajj as a way to collect intelligence. They rounded him up, they put him in indefinite detention in Guantanamo Bay, and they were and this is just one example of what was happening at Guantanamo, but that he was targeted basically